people, what's the most bizarre, not safe for work thing that happened within your workplace? I used to work at a fairly upscale hotel, and I won't be giving any names, but let's just say it was one of those high-end establishments where everything was top-notch, and the clientele was always rich and famous. The owners of this place were, interestingly enough, a movie star and a well-known politician. The hotel itself was set in a huge estate-style building with about 25 rooms, making it feel more like a private mansion than a typical hotel. Now, one of the owners, I'll leave you to guess which one, was a bit on the eccentric side, to put it mildly. She had a unique vision for the hotel, and to achieve what she called the location's flair, she'd often do things that weren't exactly within the bounds of legality or good taste. She was all about creating an atmosphere, no matter the cost or the consequences. The most bizarre incident I witnessed there, though, was something else entirely. One evening, she decided to throw a massive party for her wealthy, well-connected friends. But this wasn't your typical fancy soiree. No, this was an adult themes party. For 2 whole days, the entire hotel was shut down, and no one was allowed in or out. They had workers carrying food and drinks on trays, but there was a catch. They weren't just there to serve, they were also supposed to do it topless. Yes, you read that right. The owner approached us shift workers, asking us to participate, but we quickly shot that idea down, saying, no thanks. They ended up hiring external workers for the event instead, but the whole thing was incredibly uncomfortable for those of us who were still on duty and had to deal with it from the sidelines. While I wasn't physically present at the event, I did hear a lot of strange noises coming from the hotel during those 2 days, noises that I can only imagine were what you'd hear during what could only be described as the boink of the century. I'm sure it wasn't the kind of party that anyone would forget easily, though I'm also sure it wasn't exactly the most professional way to run a hotel either. You might be wondering, what's so NSFW about an owner using a venue for her own purposes? Well, let me tell you, cleanup was a nightmare. The aftermath of that party lingered for days. There was a distinct smell of sweat, lube, and, well, other bodily fluids in several rooms, and it took way longer than it should have to get rid of it. The worst part was what happened a couple of weeks later. A family staying in one of the rooms made a horrifying discovery. While going through a toy chest with their kids' toys in it, they found a used rubber. Naturally, they were horrified, and the hotel had to offer them a substantial compensation package for the inconvenience and the trauma. That's my story, but there's more where that came from. I've got plenty of others about safety protocols being ignored, first aid kits being nowhere to be found, and general chaos behind the scenes. But let's be real. Most people on Reddit just want the juicy stories. So there you go. A wild chapter from my time at that hotel. Story 2. My brother works at a Scottish bar, and as part of his uniform, he's required to wear a kilt. Now, my brother has always had this thing about not wearing anything under his kilt. It's kind of his thing, and he swears he's more comfortable that way. One day, he was taking a customer their bangers and mash. Nothing too out of the ordinary, but as he was walking, he slipped. The whole bar was watching as he went down, and let's just say it was a bit of a disaster. His kilt flew up, and the entire place got a very clear view of his eggs and bacon. It was one of those moments where everything seemed to slow down, and everyone in the bar got a front row seat to the unexpected reveal. Now, every time we get together, it's the first thing anyone mentions. It's become a sort of running joke in our family, and we never let him live it down. No matter what the occasion is, someone always brings up the day the whole bar saw his eggs and bacon. He doesn't like to talk about it, but we make sure it's always on the table for discussion. It's a conversation piece that we'll probably never stop bringing up. It's just too funny not to. Story 3. I had intimate relations with a coworker when I worked at a previous job. It was a cubicle environment with a raised floor, so you could hear footsteps from far away. Our desks were in an L-shaped part of the office, so it was like being in the corner. When our fellow coworkers weren't there, we'd do things. She'd always wear dresses, so I'd make her take her inners off and I'd keep it in my pocket for a while. It was titillating to know she was bare down there just a few feet away. Sometimes, I'd go into her cubicle, and she'd bend over the desk so I could slide in for a few pumps. It was difficult not to bang her until I finished, but I mean, how do you clean that up quickly if someone was coming? It was exhilarating to see her struggling to contain her moans. We did this often. Sometimes she'd come to my cubicle to talk about work and play with my fingers while she was talking to me. There was a guy who sat in the cubicle behind me, so when I did this while he was sitting there, she'd have a really hard time sounding natural. It was very exciting. One time, she accompanied me to our development lab. It was late in the afternoon, almost quitting time, and she came to keep me company while I closed down the lab. The door had a deadbolt. Wanting to take this opportunity to do something exciting, I asked if she'd give me a blowy right there in the lab. She agreed, and there I sat on an office chair while she did her thing. After we were done, I quietly unlocked the deadbolt and continued closing down the lab. Literally minutes later, my manager walked into the lab with 2 VIPs he was giving a tour to. My coworker and I just looked at each other like, that was really perilously close. Never again. We never got caught, thankfully. When our office moved to a new building, it was simply too difficult to do the same things we did before. So we just did it on business trips or after work. Story 4. At one of my old jobs, the HR woman, of all people, once cornered me in the hallway to share a story that I will never forget, no matter how much I wish I could. She launched into an overly detailed account about her son's dong. She started talking about how big the dong was, and then casually mentioned how many times it had been within kissing distance of her mouth. She said this with such fondness and enthusiasm, completely oblivious to how uncomfortable it made me. I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, frozen, nodding awkwardly while internally begging for a reason to escape. Later, I found out I wasn't the only person subjected to this bizarre overshare. Apparently, she had been telling this story to several people around the office, each time with the same unsettling level of enthusiasm. A few days later, she was fired. It turns out her inappropriate behavior wasn't limited to strange stories. The situation escalated to the point where all the locks in the office had to be changed, and we had armed security patrolling the premises for a while. From what I heard, her husband was crazy too. Story 5. One of my coworkers had a distinct sense of style, and she loved to wear miniskirts, often going commando. I know this because our cubicle desks didn't have vanity panels to block the view, and her desk faced mine across the aisle. To be clear, I wasn't trying to look or pay attention on purpose. I kept my focus on work. However, one day, she got down on her hands and knees to check the wiring on her computer, and, well, it was impossible not to notice the situation. It also became apparent that she was either a natural redhead or went to great lengths to ensure consistency. Story 6. We had a male call center manager who was using his position to hook up with women in exchange for giving them better schedules. This was all going down in a bathroom on an empty floor in our building, where it was completely out of sight. At the same time, the male sales manager was also engaging in similar activities, but with men in that same bathroom. To this day, I can't help but wonder if they ever ran into each other and had any scheduling conflicts. Story 7. A bonding day for the entire production staff was planned, offering a chance for everyone to unwind and build camaraderie. It typically lasted 4 to 6 hours at a hotel, with access to the pool, gym, sports fields, and several organized activities designed to boost morale and foster teamwork. Though alcohol is technically prohibited, it's understood that as long as you're discreet, management tends to turn a blind eye to it. During the event, I walked into a bathroom and unexpectedly found 1 woman and 3 men engaged in a threescore together. It was clear that everything was consensual. I wasn't the first person to stumble upon the scene, nor was I the last, though it seemed a bit reckless to not lock the door, given the circumstances. Management, unsurprisingly, chose to look the other way. Story 8. One time, I accidentally walked in on 2 coworkers going at it. As I stood there, completely dumbfounded, the guy looked over at me without a hint of embarrassment and casually said, "Hey, what's up?" as if he were just greeting me in the break room. I wasn't sure how to respond. I think I just muttered something awkward and walked away, leaving them to finish their business. Unfortunately, things didn't end well for that couple. A few months later, their relationship took a dark turn when he pulled a gun on her in the parking lot. And as if that wasn't enough workplace drama, there was another incident that's hard to forget. One day, I walked into a stairwell and stumbled across a female employee getting it by a customer. Fingers involved. They didn't even seem that bothered by getting caught. Between those moments and the regular chaos of the job, it's safe to say that workplace boundaries weren't exactly a priority for some people. Story 9. I used to work at one of the largest leather goods stores in the world, a place that catered to a wide range of clientele and sold everything from high-end leather jackets to intimate lifestyle products. It wasn't just the products that were unconventional, the work culture was, too. It wasn't uncommon for the sales staff to engage in very personal interactions with customers in the dressing rooms. On rare occasions, similar situations even occurred on the sales floor, although that was far less discreet. The shocking part? This behavior wasn't just overlooked by management, it was actively encouraged. They seemed to believe it added to the customer experience and built a sense of loyalty to the brand. Story 10. I used to work in a cemetery for several years, and let me tell you, there were some wild moments. One of the funeral directors had been secretly hooking up with the receptionist, and their escapades became the stuff of legend. One night, they decided to meet up in the wall crypts for a little after-hours rendezvous. Unfortunately for them, the security guard happened to be doing his rounds and caught them red-handed, or, more accurately, caught the funeral director with his pants literally down. To make matters even juicier, the guy was actually engaged to another co-worker who also worked at the cemetery. Needless to say, when the whole thing came to light, the fallout was nothing short of explosive. Let's just say the drama that followed could rival any soap opera, and the fireworks were nothing short of legendary. Story 11. I work in a hospital ER, so I've seen my fair share of bizarre situations, but this one is burned into my memory forever. One night, we had a patient come in complaining of vaginal pain. I got her prepped, worked her up, and positioned her in the stirrups so the doctor could come in and do a quick pelvic exam. Standard procedure, right? Well, as luck would have it, a critical patient rolled in right after, requiring the doctor's immediate attention. When things like that happen on a night shift in a county ER, it's all hands on deck. With only 3 nurses and 1 doctor on staff, I had to leave the pelvic exam patient for a bit to help out. After about 20 minutes, I finally had a moment to check back on her, planning to apologize for the delay and put the stirrups down so she could relax until the doctor had time. What I walked into was straight out of a scene I'll never forget. Her boyfriend was on his knees in front of her, licking the ice cream, while she was still positioned in the stirrups. I froze for a second, completely stunned, before asking him, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His response? "I just couldn't resist with her in that position." I couldn't believe the audacity. I immediately escorted him out of the room and told him to wait in the lobby while notifying security that he wasn't allowed back in. It was unbelievable. And as if that wasn't bad enough, the cherry on top of this ridiculous situation was when the test results came back. The patient had chlamydia. For those wondering, yes, I feel terrible that she was left in the stirrups for so long, but emergencies happen, and when someone's life is on the line, it takes priority. I was literally in the middle of performing CPR when I realized it had been a while. This job is never boring, but sometimes the things people do still leave me speechless. Story 12. I work in a kitchen that's connected to a bar, so I've seen my fair share of chaos, but this one still takes the cake. One night, 2 customers decided they couldn't wait to get their business elsewhere and started going at it in one of the stalls in the ladies' restroom. Now, as wild as that is on its own, here's the kicker. The stall they chose was locked from the inside, and instead of finding another stall, waiting, or taking it to their car, they decided the best course of action was to crawl under the door. Yes, you heard that right. 2 grown adults willingly got down on the dirty bathroom floor of a bar and crawled their way into a locked stall just to do the deed. If that's not some kind of devotion, I don't know what is. Story 13. Back in the early 2000s, I worked at a Nissan dealership situated at one of the busiest intersections in my city. It was a lively place, and there was never a dull moment, but one particular day has stuck with me all these years. One of the younger salesmen was in the middle of closing a deal with a woman who appeared to be in her 40s. From what I could tell, everything seemed to be going smoothly, your typical car sales scenario. During a break, I stepped out to the back car lot for a smoke, thinking it'd be a quiet moment to myself. Instead, I walked straight into a scene that still haunts me. There, wedged between 2 cars in a row of vehicles, was that same salesman and the woman he was trying to sell the car to. She was on her knees, blowing his flute right there in the lot. I was in complete and utter shock. I froze for a second, unsure if I was hallucinating or if this was actually happening. What made it even more surreal was how completely unfazed they both were. She didn't stop for even a second, and he just looked up, caught my eye, grinned like an idiot, and gave me a big thumbs up. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, or his nerve, for that matter. Now, I'm a 36-year-old woman, and while I've had my fair share of crazy workplace stories, this one still takes the cake. I think about it more often than I'd like to admit, and every time, I'm stuck somewhere between disbelief and utter cringe. Some things you just can't unsee, no matter how much you wish you could. Story 14. There was a woman I worked with who had a bit of a restless energy about her. We worked evening shifts, and since we were often unsupervised for the most part, there was a certain level of freedom in how we managed our time. Most of the time, we were focused on getting our tasks done, but there were moments where we had some downtime, and she found ways to channel that energy. She would sometimes do little exercises to burn off some of her restlessness, stretching, or moving around to stay active. One evening, I remember her deciding to do a handstand against the wall. It seemed like something she did often, just to get her blood flowing and break up the monotony of the shift. She wasn't really doing it for any particular reason, just as a way to stay energized. As she was holding the handstand, though, something unexpected happened. Her shirt shifted, and without warning, her jugs popped out. It was completely unintentional, and I'm pretty sure she didn't notice what had happened. I'm not sure she realized that I had seen it, but I did. I caught a clear glimpse of it. Story 15. There was this coworker who seemed really into me, and while I didn't feel the same way about her, I guess she became pretty desperate for some kind of attention. I didn't lead her on or give any indication that I was interested, but somehow, she got it into her head that I might be. One day, while I was working in another part of the building, she walked over to where I was. It was the middle of the day, with people around and everything. Without any warning, she just flashed me, standing there for a moment before she quickly walked away, as if nothing had happened. It caught me completely off guard, and I didn't know how to process what had just occurred. She didn't seem to care much about the situation or how it made me feel, and I was left standing there, trying to figure out what had just happened. Story 16. 2 years ago, I managed a small, family-owned bar in a quiet suburban area. It was a place where we got to know the regulars pretty well, and I made sure to keep things running smoothly. One of the bartenders I had working for me, a young woman, started to raise some red flags. She would frequently disappear from her station for long periods, and I couldn't figure out why. We had cameras set up all around the bar, inside, out back in the kitchen, but she would vanish for up to half an hour at a time. Naturally, I decided to investigate. Since the bar was small, I was close with a lot of the regulars, and I figured someone might have noticed something. After asking around, I found out that she had been, well, offering private session for money. She had been soliciting customers behind the bar. It was a huge shock, but I tried to keep my cool. She wasn't there much longer after that. I couldn't fire her for something I couldn't directly prove, but it didn't matter because I had a solid reason to let her go, neglecting her duties as a bartender. She had been written up several times for leaving the bar unattended, which violated a major part of her responsibilities. That was all I needed to get her out of there, without needing to confront the more uncomfortable part of the situation. Story 17. I used to work in an emergency room, and let me tell you, there were some things that went on behind the scenes that would definitely surprise a lot of people. While we were all focused on taking care of patients, it became pretty clear that a significant number of the nurses and paramedics were involved in their own side activities, to put it mildly. It wasn't just the usual office drama, it was much wilder. I'll never forget this one specific instance. I was walking down the hallway past a patient room, and I could hear the unmistakable sounds of, well, people banging. It wasn't subtle at all. I was trying to focus on my work, but it was hard not to notice. A few minutes later, one of the nurses and a firefighter came strolling out of the room, looking completely disheveled like nothing had happened. They casually walked back to the nurse's station, acting as if it was just another day at the office. But that wasn't the only strange incident. Another time, one of the ER physicians got caught having alcohol in his big gulp cup while working. It was a blatant violation of hospital policy, but he was still working the shift like it was just another day. It wasn't subtle either. He had been gulping down the drink while attending to patients. Eventually, it caught up with him, and things had to be handled accordingly. Then, there was the time when we discovered a nurse who had passed out in the bathroom, barely conscious, with a needle still in her arm. She was in an awful state, and it was clear what she had been using while on shift. That situation had to be dealt with too, and she was quickly removed from the floor. County hospitals can be chaotic places, to say the least. There's always something going on, both on and off the clock. While we're supposed to be providing care and maintaining professionalism, the reality is that sometimes things get out of hand. Story 18. Years ago, I worked at a manufacturing facility where a highly qualified woman was promoted to the position of line supervisor. She had earned the role through hard work, experience, and dedication, so she was more than capable of managing the responsibilities that came with it. However, not everyone was happy about the promotion. One of the men on the line, in particular, was incredibly upset by the idea of having to report to a woman. It was clear that he wasn't willing to accept the change and felt that his authority had been undermined. When the newly promoted supervisor made her first round of inspections and reviews of the line, this man decided to make his discontent known in the most inappropriate way. In a shocking act of defiance, he dropped his pants and inners in front of her and proceeded to wave his danglings at her. It was a completely unprofessional and disrespectful gesture that left everyone in the vicinity stunned. The new supervisor, who had already proven her leadership abilities, didn't hesitate in taking action. She immediately recognized the seriousness of his behavior, and without any further discussion, she made her first administrative decision as supervisor. She terminated his employment on the spot. It was a bold move, but it sent a clear message that such behavior would not be tolerated under any circumstances. Her decision was a reminder that professionalism and respect should always come first in the workplace, and no one, regardless of their gender, should have to endure disrespect or harassment. The situation also set a standard for the rest of the team, showing that there would be no tolerance for any actions that undermine the integrity of the work environment. Story 19. A while back, I walked into the office kitchen, expecting to grab a cup of tea and get back to work. However, I was immediately taken off guard when one of my female colleagues, who was much younger than me, unexpectedly removed her top and casually asked me, "What do you think of these?" I was completely blindsided by the boldness of her actions and didn't quite know how to respond. After a brief pause, I managed to say, "I've only come for a cup of tea," trying to steer the situation back to something more normal and appropriate. This girl, who was young enough to be my daughter, 20-plus years younger, in fact, didn't seem to realize the discomfort she had caused. A few days later, she came into my office again, this time wiggling her backside at me and asking, "What do you think of my bum?" At that point, I was even more taken aback, but I made it clear once again that I wasn't interested. It was becoming a recurring issue, and while I wasn't sure of her intentions, I definitely wasn't comfortable with her behavior. I decided to raise the issue with my boss, hoping for some support or action. Unfortunately, his response was less than reassuring. He just laughed it off and said, "She's a character," dismissing the whole situation as though it was no big deal. At that point, she had already resigned, and I was preparing to take over her duties, though, thankfully, without any more of the flashing or inappropriate behavior. In the time that she was with the company, she had told me she was a model, though she claimed she couldn't show me any of her photos because they weren't suitable for work. Interestingly, she had shown these photos to a very conservative sales rep, which apparently crossed a line. The sales rep ended up refusing to come back to our office, and from what I gathered, the photos were likely more explicit in nature than I had originally assumed. She had also spent a fair amount of time pole dancing in the courtyard, often in a skirt that didn't leave much to the imagination, and I'm not sure if she was wearing anything underneath. The whole experience left a lot of people talking, especially regarding my cup of tea comment. Yes, I'm British, and apparently that phrase struck a chord with a lot of people. In hindsight, I can't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all, though I still don't know if it's a memory worth keeping. Some of the comments I've received about it have been pretty entertaining, and I'm kind of hoping it gets turned into a meme for posterity. Still, I don't think it quite reaches the level of the infamous "right in front of my salad." Story 20. A group of teenagers were engaging in inappropriate behavior in a theater, which was noticed by others around them. When people became aware of what was happening, they immediately notified us, and we sent one of our officers to address the situation. The officer entered the theater, quickly apprehended the teens, and called their parents to come pick them up. In an unexpected turn of events, the mother of one of the girls didn't speak English, so the officer had to communicate with her to explain the situation. To help the mother understand what had occurred, the officer had to mime giving a blowy, as it was the only way to get the message across, and the whole thing was captured on security footage. It was the best security tape footage ever. Story 21. At my gym, something truly bizarre happened one day involving one of the trainers. After coming out of the bathroom, he ran into the main area of the gym, completely undressed and behaving erratically, screaming at the top of his lungs. He was visibly agitated, shouting and making strange noises, and it quickly became clear that he was in an extremely distressed state. His actions were so over the top and unexplainable that people around the gym were shocked and unsure how to react. In the midst of this chaotic behavior, he ended up in the weight area, where, to everyone's horror, he unloaded his mayo on preacher curl machine, then fell over and passed out. Soon after, both police and paramedics were called to the scene. They took the trainer away and worked to handle the aftermath of what had happened. Once the scene was cleared and the trainer was taken care of, the gym manager was left with the unenviable task of cleaning up the mess left behind on one of the machines. After all of this unfolded, I decided to skip my class for the day, just to stick around and see how the whole situation was handled. It definitely became the talk of the gym for a long time, and I'm sure everyone who witnessed it will never forget that day. Story 22. I worked at a small company with a tight-knit group of employees. There was this one woman in her 30s who worked in accounting. She wasn't exactly what you'd call conventionally attractive. She was a heavy smoker, which gave her voice a raspier edge, and she had a bit of a rough, trashy vibe to her. Despite that, she was funny, friendly, and a generally good person to work with. You could always count on her to lighten the mood, and she had a great sense of humor that made her easy to get along with. One day, she found some photos of me online that she seemed to like. Maybe she thought they were funny or just wanted to share them for a laugh. Either way, she showed them to a few coworkers, and I guess she thought it would be fun to get a reaction from everyone. The next time I walked into the office, she was standing there with a printout of one of the photos, grinning. I wasn't sure what was going on at first, but before I could even say anything, she looked at me and, in the loudest voice possible, said, "Let's bang." The HR lady, who was standing right next to her, froze. I saw her face shift from a look of surprise to one of disbelief, then to sheer exasperation. Her eyes went wide like she had just witnessed the most bizarre thing, and then she gave this long, disappointed stare. One of those looks that just screams, "I can't even deal with this right now." After a moment of awkward silence, she just shook her head and walked away. I, on the other hand, couldn't help but laugh at how absurd the whole situation was. Of course, I didn't take her up on her offer, as you can probably guess. It was a little cringy, but in the end, we all laughed it off and nothing more came of it. Just one of those strange office moments you'll never forget. Story 23. I was sitting in an orientation for a new job, and there was another woman sitting diagonally from me. Her spot was just across the horseshoe-shaped arrangement of tables. She had dressed up for the occasion in a silky blouse tucked neatly into a pencil skirt. She looked professional, and it was clear that she was trying to make a good first impression, just like the rest of us. The orientation was scheduled for 8 hours, so it was going to be a long day of sitting through presentations and introductions. About halfway through, right before our first break, I glanced over and noticed something a little off. A couple of the buttons on her blouse had come undone, one at the top and another in the center, so from where I was sitting, I could see the edge of her bra. It wasn't intentional, just the result of the loose, slick buttonholes on the blouse. It wasn't a huge deal, but I figured I'd mention it to her during the break, just to avoid any embarrassment. A few minutes later, I glanced over again and was surprised to see that her entire blouse had come completely undone, all the way down to where it was tucked into her skirt. Her jugs were fully visible, hanging out in plain sight. The guy sitting next to her seemed to be staring in an obvious but awkward way, but he wasn't doing anything to let her know, nor did he seem like he was going to say anything. It was such an uncomfortable situation to witness, especially since no one was stepping in to help. I tried to make eye contact with her, hoping she'd notice, and I could discreetly signal to her to fix her blouse when the instructor called for a break. Eventually, the instructor announced that he would start calling people to take their ID photos, and he called her name first. It seemed like he'd noticed what had happened as well, and he probably wanted to handle it in the least embarrassing way possible without drawing attention. He seemed to be giving her an opportunity to fix herself without making a big deal of it. When she came back from taking her photo, her blouse was buttoned again, and she looked a little more self-conscious. Later, I noticed her glancing down at her blouse, adjusting the buttons, and double-checking to make sure it was securely fastened this time. It seemed like she was trying to make sure it wouldn't happen again, likely a little embarrassed by what had unfolded. It was one of those moments where I felt for her. No one wants to be caught in an embarrassing situation like that, especially when you're trying to make a good impression. I just hope it wasn't too awkward for her when she realized what had happened. Story 24. A few years ago, I worked in a restaurant, and most of the servers were college-aged women. There were a couple of older ones, though, in their late 20s or approaching their 30s. One in particular was a bit older and had an infant. One day, the younger servers, curious about motherhood, started asking her questions about pregnancy, being a mom, and breastfeeding. When the topic of breastfeeding came up, she seemed to think the best way to explain it would be to show them. So, in the back of the restaurant, with no hesitation, she pulled her shirt up, exposed herself, and squeezed out some milk for them to see. It was definitely an unexpected moment. On top of that, I also caught a dishwasher in the back smoking crack during a shift. That was wild. Story 25. I work in the life safety department, handling the installation of fire alarms, security systems, and access control for both commercial and residential clients. One of the most memorable and bizarre jobs I worked on was at a church complex, which turned out to be one of the worst projects I've ever encountered. My coworker and I were brought in to finish a job that had been started by someone else who had quit after giving his 2 weeks' notice, leaving behind a complete mess. The sheetrock was already up in many areas, but the wiring was disorganized, junctions weren't made, wires weren't labeled, and there was no wire map. On top of that, the client kept changing their mind constantly, like when they decided to change the ceiling tiles and asked us to reinstall all the devices we just put up. It was a job that was already weeks behind schedule, well over budget, and incredibly frustrating. Finally, my coworker and I were working on the last part of the project, tying in a pull station that the client insisted be relocated. As I was focused on finishing up, I glanced over and was absolutely stunned to see my coworker squatting and taking a dump in the attic. On one hand, I was disgusted by the complete lack of professionalism. I'm proud of my work and would never do something like that. But on the other hand, I couldn't help but feel a little impressed by the level of sheer frustration and disdain he must have had for the situation to go to such an extreme. Story 26. I worked as an assistant counselor at a boys' summer camp for a few years, spending the entire summer there, staying in the cabins with the campers, and assisting with tasks like dishwashing, maintenance work, and helping at activities. I had previously been a camper there and was certified in CPR/AD. Occasionally, a camper would forget to replace their swim tag after being in the lake, which would lead to a search of the water by certified counselors. One day, after finishing a long kitchen shift, I was resting when I heard the bell ring, signaling that a camper was missing. I quickly noticed a swimsuit on the floor and, knowing time was crucial, I hurriedly changed into it and ran to the lake to join the search. Fortunately, it turned out that the camper had simply forgotten to replace their swim tag, and everything was fine. Afterward, I went into the main office to grab a towel and rested on a leather couch while catching my breath. I was chatting with two female staff members when they suddenly walked into the back office. Just then, one of the camp owners, a woman in her mid-60s, entered the main office, holding a clipboard, and sat directly across from me. A few moments later, she calmly said, "Narrator," prompting me to finish stretching. "Yeah, your swimsuit is on incorrectly." I looked down and realized that the swimsuit, which I had grabbed quickly in my rush, had been put on backward. The swimsuit had become wet from the lake, and as I walked into the office, it had shifted out of place. Over the next few days, I found out that a number of people had noticed my mistake. This was the second time that week I had unintentionally exposed myself, and it was my last summer working there. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.